So we sit here at a crypto conference in the house that Bitcoin built. Once upon a time, Bitcoin was a source of dynamism, of innovative ideas. In fact, what we see most of the conference talks talking about right now, concepts like layer 2s, NFTs, sidechains, all of it, these were Bitcoin ideas about a decade ago. But Bitcoin has been dormant. And to a generation who entered crypto over the past 2 to 3 years, Bitcoin has been laser eyes. It's been Michael Saylor. But what's interesting recently is that Bitcoin has seen a level of bottoms-up adoption from developers, from innovators, from creators that it hasn't seen in a long time. There are some technical triggers for that. But Bitcoin, once again, is systematically slept on by the crypto industry. And we're going to talk about what's next for Bitcoin. We've got a terrific panel here. And so the first question is Bitcoin dynamism. Stability for Bitcoin, a conservative approach to its evolution has been prudent. Bitcoin can never change, or Bitcoin can change a lot over time. What is the right set point for Bitcoin dynamism in your minds? Start with Eric.
Well, I think the biggest mistake that we all can do, the mistake that a lot of laser eye maxis do, is to assume that the success of Bitcoin is guaranteed. The philosophy of Bitcoin from way back was that we would take a cautious approach, be conservative, preserve the resilience of the most important chain, but incorporate the minimal features that are actually useful from other altcoin chains, learn from them, and incorporate them back into the mothership if they make sense. What has happened in the later years is that there's been like a full resistance to change Bitcoin at all. Basically, we've tried to inspire belief that Bitcoin is completely fine as it is. We'll just use Lightning. We won't need to change the block size. We won't need to do anything. And we'll still be able to onboard the masses, even if that means that 95% of Lightning users use custodial wallets, which obviously does not align with the true values of Bitcoin. So there is a need for some shake-up in the culture. Maybe I'll just leave it at that and let the other speakers chime in.
So I would say, first of all, I'm feeling extremely underdressed sitting right next to Eric right now. But with that said, I think the high-level thing for me is Bitcoin is not a religion. It is a software project. And like any software project, it needs to be maintained. It needs to be upgraded every once in a while. And you can have the philosophy that very basic, simple things will happen at the Bitcoin L1 layer. But I do think when taking Bitcoin to even a billion people or hundreds of million people, it's not going to happen at the L1, right? So not only that L1 needs to change to that reality slowly, carefully, but we'll need very, very reliable and fast Bitcoin L2s to be able to actually get to a billion users.
Yeah, I think what I would say is I'm continually astonished by the Bitcoin community's inability to look at empirical reality. They seem to live in their heads and this sort of idealistic world, and then they just entirely deny actual facts about the world as they emerge. So take Lightning. Lightning is compelling, it's cool, it has certain use cases, but just objectively speaking, it's very small. It's niche, right? So as the preordained scaling approach for Bitcoin, it's probably not the way, right? Take the fact that Greg Maxwell invented the idea of a rollup, or at least was one of the forefathers there. Rollups empirically have been incredibly successful on Ethereum, and yet there's virtually no motivation in the Bitcoin community to create a soft fork, to insert a rollup, right? So this is what shocks me. Clearly the right pacing is more than once every decade in terms of the change to Bitcoin. It's been years and years. So it needs to be more than once every 5 years. And we just need to consider actual facts about the world. I think it's a very simple thing to do, but Bitcoiners refuse to do it.
Yeah, so the argument for ossification is that if we introduce a bug on L1, that would be catastrophic for Bitcoin as the base layer of a financial system. And so, there is some merit to that idea. However, we have undergone many changes with Bitcoin over the years. Taproot, SegWit, people forget also BIP39 way back in the day made it much easier to back up, to write your 12 to 24 words down. Before that, it was actually more complicated. So, these improvements to Bitcoin have occurred all throughout Bitcoin's history. So the ossification camp chooses to ignore all of Bitcoin's development history with this idea that if we introduce anything to Bitcoin, it introduces risk, which is true. But this is open source code. It's these proposals take a long time to go through. Drive chains, for example, were talked about for over 8 years. I'm not advocating for Paul's method of getting drive chains initiated or reviewed, but it has been under review and looked at by a lot of people for 8 years. The Bitcoin community also, so they go, okay, you can't build an L1, so go build an L2, and you're like, cool, so I'll take a look at DLCs, stacks, rollups, and they're like, no, you can't do that. You can just build on Lightning. And Lightning and every L2 has its own game theoretic and design trade-offs. So I think I want to see kind of a world where we see L2s blossom and a lot more, applications that are specific per L2.
Yeah. Well said. I think that there's a difference between being very deliberate in what you change and losing the capacity for change as a whole. And I feel like that is what we are at risk of as Bitcoiners right now. And one challenge that many of us foresee in the future is what happens when the block subsidy declines? And what happens if there isn't enough chain utilization for fees to compensate for that? It's a big problem that we will need to innovate our way out of. And so I would love to hear from the panel, maybe we can start with Nick, around what are possible solutions around this challenge, and are there sacred cows, dare I say, tail emissions, that could even be part of the solution?
Well, we agreed we wouldn't spend the whole panel talking about tail emissions or the decaying block subsidy, but the fact is, fees appear to be a race to the bottom on blockchains. Not just on Bitcoin. Look at Ethereum. People create new block space as it gets congested, and people will move to cheaper block space to transact. That's a fact. So banking the future of any L1 on sustained fees appears questionable. On Bitcoin, we've seen, yes, 2 high episodes of fees in the history of Bitcoin, but right now it's virtually nothing. So how can we bank the entire future of this thing on the existence of fees? And now, look, maybe tail emission is not the way, right? Maybe that violates the inherent Bitcoin social contract that's too difficult to digest. Maybe that's not the way. Clearly something has to happen, though. Something clearly has to happen. I would propose, that maybe not a serious proposal, but I'd invite people to consider a model whereby you take coins that have moved in 10 years and you just recycle them into the block subsidy. I know it's going to make the laser eyes on Twitter very upset, but that way you stay within the 21 million cap, and you've unlocked a basically immobile tranche of coins to fund security. So that would be my humble suggestion.
So I'll jump in here because I think, at the core premise of this argument is that the declining subsidy, is not being replaced by fees. Will there be a moment where Bitcoin security becomes inherently weak? And then, to Nick's point, is Blockspace fungible, or is Blockspace unique, and will demand for Blockspace increase over time? I think Satoshi had a really interesting quote that kind of summarizes the core argument really eloquently, where he says there will either be a lot of transactions or very little. And so in Bitcoin's ultimate, when it comes into maturity, if a bunch of L2s have bloomed and there's a lot of activity on those will have demand for Bitcoin L1 block space. There'll be high value container ships, your blog post you wrote a long time ago. Not containers, but container ships. L1 transactions on Bitcoin will be high value transactions. So that's the core part of this argument is how do we increase transactional demand for L1s? And that's where I think the L2s give a pretty compelling argument. But I do agree with Nick. if there are other ways to fix this problem, if demand for Blockspace doesn't increase to the level we need to.
Yeah, I would say that there's been optimism around some of the new types of use cases appearing on Bitcoin. I think in the Stacks ecosystem, in the Ordinals ecosystem, I think we've seen perhaps like different fee base loads, and maybe there's just an organic adoption solution to this. Maybe I'd love for Muneeb and Eric to comment on how is Bitcoin's a new qualitative uptake for Bitcoin through things like Ordinals, through what you've seen in the Stacks ecosystem. Is that enough? Can we just use it in different ways?
Yeah. All right. I'll quickly chime in. So I think first of all, 2023 has been an amazing year for Bitcoin. Right? Like I characterize the time between 2017 when the block size civil war happened and 2022 as the dark ages of Bitcoin, where not a lot of development is happening. Like, I joke that I would go to like crypto founder dinners and people would introduce me as this is Muneeb, he's the only person building on Bitcoin, right? That was kind of like a joke, but pretty sad that you don't want to be the only person building on Bitcoin. And 2023, I think there's a marked shift because of Ordinals, which you'll hear more about from Eric, and actual Bitcoin fees going up. There was a 50x or more increase depending on how you measure it, and real interest in both capital and founders and developers to come and build in Bitcoin. And that is really good for Stacks, which is a Bitcoin L2. We wouldn't get into the debate of like how do you define L2s, but effectively we want traffic to move to L2s and new types of use cases to be experimented with on L2s. And some of those things will live on L1, like Ordinals make a ton of sense to live on the L1, but we need a booming experimentation ecosystem of rollups, L2s around the Bitcoin economy. And I think it's finally happening. 2023 was a remarkable year in the Bitcoin dev community, and I'd love to hear more from Eric.
I think it's easy to get too honed in on the specific protocols of like Stacks and Ordinals and drive chains. I think the more important part to understand and recognize is that there's a fight for the soul of Bitcoin going on at the moment between the people that think that success is inevitable and those that feel that we still have something that we have to fight for, that we have to fight for Bitcoin success. And there are more of us that are starting to appear over the last year. There's a so-called Bitcoin Season 2 emerging. That, to me, is one of the most bullish signals for Bitcoin, or perhaps the only bullish signal for Bitcoin, seeing as the trodden path that the existing Bitcoin movement for the last couple of years has been headed towards does not, in any empirical way, appear to lead to any material success in any metric. We're losing on how many transactions the blockchain settles. We're losing on how much value the blockchain settles. We're losing out on being able to use Bitcoin as the #1 unit of account in transactions. There are more people pricing things in Ether than they are in Bitcoin. And this is if you want to establish Bitcoin as actually hard money for the world, which could be, like, this is a pretty important thing that we're trying to do. Bitcoin might be the only thing that's like a credible threat to the central banking system. I mean, I love Ethereum. I think it's a great alternative, but if we lose Bitcoin, that's a loss. I don't know if the rest of the crypto ecosystem can recover from that loss. So fighting for that culture, having a resurgence of innovation experimentation on Bitcoin is one of the most important things that we can be fighting for. And if you do that through Stacks, drive chains, or Ordinals, doesn't really matter. Let's just get back to innovating. Let's get back to building. And if you think that I look like a clown on stage, well, I got news for you people. We are fucking clowns in this industry. Look at FTX. Look at Michael Saylor. Look at Swan. Look at Prime Trust. Look at Fortress. It's frankly a clown show in crypto right now. So we might as well start dressing the part until we get to the point where we actually put the industry back in fashion. And when we get to that point, then we can suit up and say that, OK, success is inevitable. So I look exactly like the way that the industry is in the moment. So we are all clowns, sadly.
This is a very hard point to follow, Eric. But I will say one thing. Tron does more fees than Bitcoin right now. Tron. And everyone in the West, they hate Tron, or they don't even know what it is. It does more fees because people do stablecoin transactions on Tron. Where's the stablecoin utility on Bitcoin? That's where Tether emerged. Tether first emerged on Bitcoin on the Omni blockchain. That was deprecated recently. Stablecoins were born on Bitcoin, and now there aren't any. I think part of the means to increase semantic or economic density, which is what we're talking about here, increase the value payload attached to each byte on the Bitcoin blockchain, you need to look at where the world is going and what people are using blockchains for. That appears to be stablecoins. I know Dan's going to make fun of me because, I shouldn't be on here shilling stablecoins, but people appear to really like using stablecoins. There's two ways Bitcoin could do that. One, have them settle on the blockchain, maybe with Lightning. The other, create synthetic stablecoins based on Bitcoin. That way you harmonize Bitcoin as an SOV, but you acknowledge that people do want to use as an MOE something that's dollar denominated. I don't see any discussion in the Bitcoin community about this.
Yeah, well said.
I want to chime in on this Bitcoin culture thing, right? So one of the most interesting things for me is that earlier, whenever there would be a debate in the Bitcoin community, people would try to create a fork of Bitcoin, like Bcash is a big example, and then really sort of like corner themselves. Like all of these Bitcoin forks have less than 1% of Bitcoin market cap. The interesting thing that's happening in 2023 right now is there's a fork of Bitcoin culture without forking the chain, right? So it's the same chain, but there's a different community, a community of builders, like we call them Bitcoin builders. Most people on this panel would associate more with builders than the laser eyes. But because you're using the same protocol, you can't stop the Stacks miners from transacting on Bitcoin L1. You can't stop people from using Ordinals. Ordinals is actually now doing more traffic on the L1 than normal payment transactions. So I think that makes me very optimistic. It's a little bit like we aren't going away. Builders are here. It's a permissionless open network. You can't stop us. And there is more momentum around building on Bitcoin than the same old sort of like the culture that you've been hearing about in the last 5 years. So I am frankly very optimistic and bullish on the future of Bitcoin right now.
I mean, Bitcoin builders, that was the original culture of Bitcoin. When we talked about earlier, the early culture of Bitcoin being, you had rare Pepes, the first NFTs in the world, started on Bitcoin, on Counterparty. Mm-hmm. Bitcoin was the first one to have stablecoins, USDT, using Omni. So Bitcoin actually had a more permissive open culture. Again, Bitcoin's early culture is very radical and liberal. These are people buying drugs on Silk Road, after all, the early era. And so I think, that early culture is a big culture of building. No one got any, no one threw shade for getting into rare Pepes. It was kind of cool if you had one. And so we're seeing that kind of come back to Bitcoin's original culture. I think like currently what happened is a very kind of ultra-conservative culture took over, but started to represent a bigger voice. And so I'm very much looking forward to that culture going back to a builder's culture. And what's funny is that the builder's culture has a very simple premise. Bitcoin is permissionless. You can't say shit if I want to build anything I want on it because it's permissionless after all. And there's this weird vibe from the ultra-conservative folks. Some people refer to them as laser eyes, et cetera, where ordinals came about, which did not break any rule of Bitcoin, and they called those shitcoins, which is ridiculous because it's on Bitcoin, and it's going back to Bitcoin's OG culture of embracing the NFTs and other things, et cetera. And so what's hilarious is that they're authoritarian. They're not actually open at all. And that sort of culture where they're anti-NFTs, they're anti-ordinals, they're also anti-lending and borrowing. They call it usury. I mean, I haven't heard that word since I read like medieval history in fucking grade school, right? So like, a very ultra-conservative culture. And I think that over time, the moderates who are kind of the builders inherently will win because they don't, they're permissionless and they allow a bigger network effect of individuals to come build and be embraced.
Yeah, I agree. And I said at the beginning that I think Bitcoin is systematically underappreciated. And a big part of it is I think that every time we have a new crypto cycle, the number of people that join in that cycle dwarfs the numbers that have joined in previous cycles. And so the cohort of 2020 to 2022 crypto entrants are the crypto market. And Bitcoin is not, they have no institutional memory for Bitcoin as actually being a source of innovation. And I think that's the opportunity to resuscitate it because unlike other ecosystems, Bitcoin has legitimacy in a way where others are trying to bootstrap legitimacy as a function of their ecosystem that's grown. And so I think it's a very different story, which is why I think it's deeply underappreciated and why it's going to be very surprising. We touched on layer 2s, sidechains for Bitcoin. I want to start with Muneeb because I want to give him a layup, but I want to hear from other people as well. So let's pick a time horizon in the medium-term future. Let's call it 3 years. What % of Bitcoin transactions will occur on layer 2s or sidechains versus layer 1?
Yeah, so I think, let me start off by saying that I'm having a lot of chat with developers or even Web 2 companies who want to come and start building in Web 3 and so on. And right now, the state of the market is that people are either looking at Ethereum, which realistically means looking at an ETH2, like Polygon, Arbitrum, Optimism, whatever that is. Or the second category is the alt L1s. This is the Solanas and Aptos and Avalanches of the world. And interestingly, there is the third market, which you're talking about, is very underappreciated, which is building on Bitcoin. And when we talk to developers and when we talk about Bitcoin's durability, we talk about $500 billion of capital mostly just sitting there, not being used in DeFi, not being made productive. Like people click with that. People understand that yes, the L2s and L1 infrastructure might be not as mature right now, but they see the opportunity, right? So in terms of again, various works are happening, but Stacks L2 is kind of like one of them. But I view Bitcoin L1 as a settlement layer, almost as a cold storage wallet. Very high value transactions would happen on the L1. So I will move my BTC occasionally from cold storage, and my hot wallet would be L2, whichever one. Maybe Rollups in the future if we have the opcodes on the L1. And I think most transactions would just happen on the L2 because that's the future that even ETH is going towards, right? Everything is pointing to the fact that L2s on ETH is the future. So if most apps are going to live on L2s anyway, why not have a stable, durable base layer that Bitcoin L1 sort of already has? And maybe make a few tweaks within the next 5 years to introduce verification opcodes for rollups. And I think then you can talk about ossifying Bitcoin. Maybe Bitcoin doesn't need to change after that, minus some of the security budget thing, which I think, by the way, there are Bitcoin that are on burn addresses, and there are ongoing burns happening, and you can actually recycle some of those into the supply as well. But the fact that we can have that conversation is actually, I think, step number 1.
Who says Bitcoin isn't eco-friendly? We can be recycling coins. Eric, Muneeb mentioned verifying zero-knowledge proofs on-chain as an option to have ZK rollups for Bitcoin. Will we have ZK rollups on Bitcoin? And if so, what do we need to make them a reality?
To make them a reality, I think that we need to reframe or recontextualize the entire dialogue in Bitcoin. Nick was saying previously about Gregory Maxwell. I don't know how many people in this audience knows about who Gregory Maxwell is, but Gregory Maxwell is basically like the Albus Dumbledore of Bitcoin, okay? And a lot of Bitcoin culture today is inspired by the words of Gregory Maxwell. In the Bitcoin maximalism, within the Bitcoin maximalist camp, they often derive their source of moral compass and direction from the words of Gregory Maxwell. But if you actually go back to back in 2013 and look at what Gregory Maxwell was posting on the forums, he was trying to engineer how you could make a blockchain compress. If you would try to compress the computation in a blockchain as much as you could, you would leverage zero-knowledge proofs. And he even said that he went to, in 2013, he went to a presentation by Eli Ben-Sasson, who's the founder of Starkware, and was blown away what they were doing with Starks. And he was like, this is something that we actually can use to scale Bitcoin. The technology wasn't mature back then. In 2013, it wasn't performant enough. It has gotten into a performance stage right now. And when Gregory Maxwell was faced with the zero knowledge, ZK rollups are actually happening on Ethereum, he didn't say, oh, this is stupid and idiotic. He said, well, those guys had the venture funding from the, they had the ICO from Ethereum, so they had more capital, and yeah, they pulled it off. So he was more like sad that he couldn't take full credit on it, not saying that this is a stupid idea or anything like that. So in order to get this to actually happen on Bitcoin, we have to recognize that the smartest people in Bitcoin, since Bitcoin's invention, since its inception, has always been about like how do we actually leverage zero knowledge proofs, both to scale the chain, but also to succinctly verify the computation on side chains. That is essentially what ZK rollups are. That is what, when the Blockstream company was founded, what they wanted to do most of all was to use snarks and starks to verify. So the way that the Bitcoin community has thought about Ethereum is that, fine, it's okay to want to do smart contracts on a blockchain, but you should not run all the computation in parallel at every single node. That's just fundamentally unscalable. What you should do is you should have a way to succinctly verify the computation of a separate system like a sidechain. That is basically what we wanted to do with Bitcoin, and that is possible right now. That is actually what the Ethereum community is doing. So if we go back to that original philosophy that we're supposed to take the best pieces out of the cake and bring it back to the Bitcoin mothership, that future is now. That future is actually here.
That's right.
So there are groups around Bitcoin right there. There are chat groups where people are talking about how do we actually construct these zero knowledge proof in a sort of in a technological sense that would fit well with the Bitcoin culture and like its technology. So that is happening, but in order for that to be a realistic opportunity, we need to reframe the story. We need to tell the story from where it actually begun, so that the people who came into Bitcoin at 2020 and thought that the only thing you were supposed to do was to buy Bitcoin and hold it, and then it'll go to stock to flow model, they go to $1 billion. We need to like recalibrate them and actually point to those original thought leaders like Gregory Maxwell and say that this is the journey that we're actually on. Like we are not, the people here on this stage, we are not the people that are coming in and say, hey guys, let's change things up, let's change things up. It's the Bitcoin maximalismists are the tourists in Bitcoin. They are the ones like that sort of invaded here, set up camp, and took up all this space. But sort of the original Bitcoin community are a bunch of people that always wanted to do this since the very beginning. Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer.
Well said. And I think there is a good argument that adding an opcode to verify proofs on chain could be a balance of a minimal upgrade to the chain that allows maximal extensibility in a way that doesn't compromise the ideals behind having a really stoic and solid chain underpinning everything we do. I want to shift gears a little bit because we're close to time here, and I want to talk about Bitcoin's milestones. I think that I could make the case that nation-state adoption of Bitcoin was the biggest milestone that it's achieved thus far. Nick, what's the next milestone for Bitcoin?
I mean, look, I wish we had better nation states adopting us. But honestly, I think a ZK rollup, opcode, soft fork is one of the most critical things that needs to happen in Bitcoin now. It's an easy win. It's not very controversial, or it ought not be controversial. And it unlocks a huge design space. It's an unambiguous, massive technological innovation that has been proven on Ethereum. If the Bitcoiners are true to their original vision of bringing the best innovation from the altcoin space, then they'll do this. So for me, that would be proving that Bitcoin can continue to upgrade itself. That's the number one, most important thing.
How about you, Dan? Milestone for Bitcoin?
That's a tough question. For me, with my professional background, I do growth marketing, user acquisition. So naturally, new adoption of Bitcoin is something I care about deeply. I think the more speculative, it is undeniable that Bitcoin's primary adoption loop is from the speculative cycles in 13, 17, and 2021. This is the objective reality. It did not come from people buying fucking coffees in Venezuela. It came from people speculating and trading, mainly in Asian, Western, and European markets. That's important to highlight because a lot of people don't find that as utility. But speculation is the initial utility that brings and pulls people in. Even Satoshi hypothesized this before Bitcoin was worth a penny. Those speculators, the ones that stick around, become the hodlers because they truly understand and they're educated about Bitcoin. And that's why there's a floor in the bear market, is that there's true believers. So speculation is how they come in, and then they stick around for the sound money. Bitcoin only has very few speculative games. It just has spot trading. And what I noticed at NFT NYC was a lot of folks, buying an NFT for 0.1 ETH and flipping it for 0.3, and they had no idea how ETH worked. They had no idea about the monetary policy, but that's how they got introduced to Bitcoin, or ETH. And what I realized is that's the same mechanic of people getting introduced to Bitcoin through spot trading. And so the more speculative games through ordinals, the more NFTs we have, the more options, futures, DeFi on top of Bitcoin, that is the next milestone for Bitcoin, is bringing DeFi and bringing it back to Bitcoin, because it brings those speculative games back to Bitcoin, which brings about greater adoption in a bull run.
Yeah, well said. And I think what you've heard is that what's next for Bitcoin, it's not about who buys it next. It's about, can we open a new chapter for how Bitcoin's used, what's done with Bitcoin, and the shape of the Bitcoin ecosystem overhaul. Let's applaud the panel here. They've done a great job. And thanks, guys.